Welcome. What we're going to do basically is run through a class that I've previously delivered in the 476 a couple of times, but not for a good couple of years, if not slightly longer. So bear with me because I'm a bit rusty with doing this stuff. It's not really intended to be a me chatting at everybody and just going through stuff. It's very much a case of sharing information amongst us all. So, if anyone will come to a specific slide or point or whatever has some information they want to share or whatever, then feel free. Likewise, any questions or whatever that crop up as we go, feel free to shout out. Don't wait till the end of anything or anything like that. Quite a lot of slides in this, but the amount of information in it isn't really that much. It's mostly a case of talking points and things to get everything going. So to start with, excuse me, the first thing we'll go through is missile flight and guidance itself, sort of background on how it works, and obviously much with everything. This is a mix of real life and then DCS-isms. So yeah, we'll crack on. If at any point the slides are out of sync or anything from what you've seen on the presentation, give me a shout as well, because that might happen from time to time. So first one, 3 parts to it. Again, nice and simple really. We'll go through different aspects of the missile systems themselves, so propulsion, control, guidance, a little bit of background on variations of each, how it all works, just to basically put a big picture on how these big darts of death actually work. So first up then, missile propulsion and control. Obviously, I'm not going to read through this line by line because you can do that yourselves. But essentially, as I'm sure most, if not all of you are aware, most air-to-air and surface-to-air missiles are generally rocket-powered. Some out there use ramjets or a combination of rocket and ramjet. However, to my knowledge, at present, unless anything's changed in the past few months, there isn't anything in DCS at the moment that uses ramjet. Obviously, when it comes to rockets, solid rocket motors are the primary use because they're high thrust to weight ratio and no complexities of additional things like throttle controls, etc. No fuel tanks to worry about, and they've got a long shelf life and storage life, and they're not susceptible to things like temperatures and stuff like that, like liquid rockets can be. The downside of solid boosters, however, is that they've got a very, very high thrust but a very short burn time, only measured in a couple of seconds. That produces a lot of acceleration, but it doesn't allow for a great sustained flight time. The most critical point of that for us, as I think most people will be aware, is that the time you've got where the rocket's burning and things like missile approach warning and your Mark 1 eyeball can pick up a missile is pretty short. Once the motor burns out, it becomes a purely ballistic object, and it's got the energy it's got at the end of that burn. So for the rest of its flight, it is unpowered. So the majority of a missile's flight, 3/4, sometimes even more, it is just an unpowered dart. Some missiles, especially your medium and long range types, they use a 2-stage solid rocket motor. So essentially it's one engine that's got 2 types of fuel in it. So the first part will be a high thrust, normally slightly smokier, quick burning boost motor, and then they'll transition into a slightly lower thrust, longer burning sustainer motor. But even then, something like an AMRAAM, for example, which has got a boost and sustain fades, the total burn time of that motor is still only measured in a few seconds. Okay, so yeah, key points on that one. Obviously, high thrust, short burn time for solid rockets. Most systems tend to use 2-stage boost sustain motors, apart from your short range systems. Smoke plumes, which are obviously quite common, certainly with the older stuff. When you get into sort of your single digit SAMs and your older air-to-air missiles, a lot of smoke coming from the motor and finite amount of energy. As far as missile control goes, there's 3 or 4 sort of variations on the theme. Most of them, missiles out there in DCS, tend to use control surfaces to control direction. 3 variations of that. You've either got canards, which is your forward fins, something like an AIM-9. Wing control, which is the central fins, something like the AMRAAM, for example, uses a wing control. And then tail control systems. Really, in all practice for us in DCS, there's no real practical difference between them. The other type that you'll sometimes see are your thrust vector control missiles that tend to be primarily your short-range systems, your IR, air-to-air missiles, and short-range air defense systems. Things like ASRAAM, AIM-9 X-ray, stuff like that tend to use sort of thrust vector systems. But again, downside of the thrust vector system is it only works while the motor's burning. I don't think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, if they know any different, but I don't think anything in DCS uses that at the moment. So for us, we're dealing with, aerodynamically controlled systems. What that does mean, obviously, for us, is that the slower a missile is going, the less control it has, the less G it has available to it. So when you're dealing with a missile that is at the start of its flight, so you're close in, it launches at you, it's got a lot of airspeed, a lot of energy with which to make those maneuvers. So obviously being unpowered, being uncrewed, being just a weapon system at the end of the day, the missile has no limits on G, practically speaking, beyond obviously what the electronics and airframe can be designed to support. So 30 Gs plus is perfectly possible for a missile. Now that bleeds off very quickly with motors burning out. Most missiles only have a couple of turns in them. Now, obviously, most systems are primarily aerodynamic control, say high speed, better control performance, turning bleeds energy, and limited. And all missiles have some sort of limited control power. There's generally two main systems that are used for SAMs and AAMs, and that is either a hydraulic control system or a electrical control system. There are some out there that in the past that have used a compressed gas type, normally nitrogen type system. However, they tend to be less now. Electrical systems are generally the best and what most modern systems tend to use. So that'll take power from the missile's thermal battery and just use an electric motor to control the fins. Hydraulic systems, so for example, some like the older SA2s, etc., think systems like that, they tend to use hydraulic control system. Most of the hydraulic control systems out there for missiles were non-return. So once fluid was used by the actuators, it'd be bled overboard. So there's no return to a reservoir or anything like that, like you get on an aircraft. So that obviously significantly restricts the lifetime of the control system. Whereas your electrical systems, they'll have some form of control as long as the missile has power, which for most thermal batteries is going to be far longer than the practical life, range of the weapon, etc. Big takeaway from that one really is that for us, at least in DCS, there's no way you're not going to be able to run, have a missile that is still a threat to you or still running at you after its control powers run out. You're not going to be able to maneuver a missile to the point of running out of its ability to control or anything like that, at least in DCS. It's a possibility in reality, but not for us. Certainly when I've gone through the lures and stuff in the past, that sort of stuff isn't really simulated. The only thing that's simulated for us in DCS is total missile lifetime. So essentially simulating the battery, capability of the weapon system. Most of them, tend to be, I think the longest I've sort of seen is 100, 120 seconds, something like that. That only obviously becomes a factor in things like your scary stuff like your SA-10, that sort of thing. Okay, so one of the main, sort of a quick rundown on that. The main sort of meat of it, though, for this one is the missile guidance. Missile guidance, obviously, as its name suggests, is how we get the missile from the starting launch position to the target. Hopefully, in a manner that will allow it to intercept and get the warhead close enough to do its job. So once the target has been designated, acquired, tracked, etc., by the threat radar system, the the job then is to get the missile from a starting position to the target. Now, there are a couple of ways to do that. We'll go into those as we go on. Most of the systems, well, really all of the systems that you'll see variational guidance for will be covered in this one in varying degrees. So we'll sort of make a go from there. There's some sort of minor variations from reality in DCS. As and when we come to them, I'll try and remember to mention them. Again, if anyone else has got anything, please feel free to jump in. And yeah, we'll go from there. So missile guidance then. It's broken up into a few phases. Initially, what you'll get is the boost phase. So this is the point where the missile comes off the rail and starts flying. Most surface-to-air missiles and some air-to-air missiles during the boost phase are completely unguided. So, for example, SA2, SA3, SA5, SA4, SA6, I think Patriot and SA10 as well. Most of them are unguided for the first few seconds of their flight. So essentially, operator hits the launch button, rocket motor ignites, missile goes flying off in whatever direction it comes off the rail. After an amount of time, which varies between missile to missile, they then start their actual guidance phase. So this is the point where you'll see a launch coming up, and essentially it may not look like it's coming your way. A missile will come up and it'll head in a completely different direction. Then all of a sudden it'll suddenly veer, towards its target. Then we've got the mid-course phase. So this is where the missile's being guided to the target. Guidance systems illuminating the target will either command the missile to change its course, or the missile's internal guidance system will change course in response to the signals it's receiving. Now, the control vanes change pitch, roll, pitch, and yaw in some combination. Some missiles only have 2-axis, some have 3-axis controls to control the missile flight path. Normally, it's gas generators, electrical motors, say high pumps in some that deflect the vanes. Each missile, limited power, etc. So the more it's manoeuvring during this mid-course phase, that can shorten its effective range. What most missiles will tend to do is go straight into either a pure pursuit or a lead pursuit course. We'll cover into that a bit later on in an attempt to get to the target. Terminal phase is the last part of the missile's flight. This is where essentially it's getting to the target and it's trying to do its best to get close enough to the aircraft it's targeting to cause the fuse to detonate the warhead. Most missiles out there will have either a contact fuse or a proximity fuse. Some will have both. Generally speaking, most these days will have a proximity fuse at the very least. Proximity fuses will either be radar, based on Doppler gates for things like semi and fully active radar missiles. So, things like your SA5s, etc., 2s, things like that, will use a radar Doppler gate to determine when they're getting close to the target. Things like your IR missiles, like, your SA9s, SA13s, Sidewinders, things like that, they all tend to use an IR laser, which essentially will have 4 IR laser transmitters around the body of the missile. Once it essentially gets a range return off that laser, it will determine if it's close enough, and it'll make the whole thing go boom. Now, missile guidance, there are quite a few variations on this. I'm sure you'll be familiar with a lot of them, but we'll start going through them in detail. So, 4 main sort of categories at the top level: preset guidance, command guidance, beam riding, and homing. Homing is the one that most people tend to be most familiar with. Preset, we'll go through it for a bit of background in this, but it's not generally used that much these days, certainly in surface-to-air and air-to-air. Command is generally your older systems. Beam riding, apart from a couple of exceptions, doesn't tend to be used in anti-air systems, but we'll cover it anyway. So, preset guidance, as the name suggests, that's where essentially the target point for the weapon system is set prior to launch, using essentially either dead reckoning or INS to get to a preset point. Also INS assisted GPS these days. As I'm sure you've probably worked out, that doesn't tend to be used for surface-to-air missiles now. It's generally for surface-to-surface or air-to-surface. There were some systems in the past, sort of late 50s, early 60s, that used it, but they were generally like designed for like anti-bomber work with like tactical nuclear warheads on them, so they didn't really need to get that close. Apart from those days, that's long gone now. Command guidance. So this is the one that is often slightly misunderstood, I think, but it's actually the most common system you'll see in the Warsaw Pact sort of side missiles. Russian especially, some of the newer Chinese systems as well, up until you get into your really new double-digit stuff. So there's a couple of subcategories of this one, which we'll go into, but essentially command guidance, think of it as radio control. In the same way as you've got a radio controlled plane, you fly it around, you look at it, see where it is, and you try and steer it to where it needs to be. That's essentially what command guidance is about. There's a couple of subtypes to it, which we'll go through. The first one is radio command or command off line of sight, COLOS. That's the first sort of SAM guidance system that was used in things like your SA2, SA3. The way it essentially works is that all the guidance work is actually done by the SAM target tracking radar and command center. So all the missile is doing is receiving commands from that command center. It has no internal radar. It has no, guidance computer, INS, anything like that. The only thing it's got internally is a set of gyros to enable it to basically do what it's told, and if it's not told anything, stay in a straight line. Now, the way COLOS works, so take something like an SA2, TTR locks you up. It then knows your range, your altitude, bearing, etc. It knows the point of the missile, where the missile is, so it then all it has to do is steer the missile to intercept point with you. It does that by way of a missile uplink. In the earlier systems, that's a one-way uplink, so it sends commands to the missile it can't receive from the missile. What that requires is two radar beams, essentially. You've got one beam tracking the missile itself, one beam tracking the target. Then you've got the computers in the TTR and the command station matching the two up and giving guidance commands to the missile to get them to hopefully meet the target in space. Some systems, especially your longer range systems, they use a mix of COLOS and INS guidance. The INS guidance is used to essentially have the missile fly in a straight line to a predetermined point. So that's its mid-course phase. So in its mid-course phase, it's just flying in a straight line to a predetermined point in space, at which point in the terminal phase, the system will actually start giving guidance commands to the missile. That doesn't seem to be reflected in DCS at the moment. All DCS missiles I've looked into, they basically start guiding and actively steering from launch after they've got past their initial boost phase. That is part of the reason why you'll sometimes see a range discrepancy with weapon systems compared to what they might do in reality, because obviously as the system is steering, from the get-go, it's bleeding more energy, so it can't necessarily travel as far. When it comes to COLOS systems, what you're actually trying to defeat for the most part is the target tracking radar, not the missile. You defeat the TTR, by default you defeat the missile, because if the TTR can no longer track or see you, then the missile can't be guided onto you. Now, DCS, obviously things like ECM aren't really that effective. Someone who's been flying a lot more recently might be able to say otherwise, but certainly when I looked into it, while ECM does have some of an effect on SAMs, it generally doesn't have an effect in a useful range envelope. So while it might take a couple of miles off the maximum lock range, for example, that lock range that it takes off will actually be outside the launch range anyway. Just 1 second while I grab a drink and have a breath. Anyone got any questions on that so far? Or any points they want to share? Okie dokie. Right, next variation we get then is CLOS, command to line of sight. So this one is similar to COLOS with the exception of it doesn't require range. So what we're doing now is essentially target is over there on that bearing. I'm going to send a missile down that bearing in the hopes that it gets to it. Obviously what that means is as the target moves, you know, you're updating the missile's bearing every few seconds or a few tenths of a second, whatever it may be, depending on the, you know, the processing rate of your system. So the missile essentially is going to follow a curved course to intercept. Not terribly efficient, and it relies on a much more effective radio environment, a much more permissive radio environment, because you need to be able to send guidance signals to the missile throughout its entire flight. That's very susceptible to jamming, this, that, and the other. So it doesn't tend to be used as often these days. In fact, I can't think of any system out there that is actively using it at the moment. A couple of subtypes to this one. So the first one, I say, not really used, manual command line of sight. This is where you've got a physical human operator that is both tracking the missile's position and tracking the target's position and trying to steer the missile to the target. There are some of you may be familiar with, depending on what aircraft you fly in DCS, there are some air-to-surface systems out there that do this. I can't remember what it is, but I know there's one on the Vigan that does, things like that. That's what it is manual command line of sight, MCLOS. Quite literally, you're flying a radio-controlled aircraft. Obviously, as you can imagine, not terribly efficient for striking air targets. However, it is used as a backup guidance system for some of the earlier Russian surface-to-air missile systems. Obviously intended for, you know, massive ECM environment where, you know, they can't get radar locks, etc., you know, things like that. So they've got some method of at least scaring the enemy into submission. Not likely to be effective, but, you know, at least it causes the enemy to have to do something. Next one, SACLOS, one that people would be familiar with but might not necessarily realise it. Most notably used in DCS and the SA-19. Now, SACLOS, as its name suggests, you can read it on the screen, semi-automatic command to line of sight. In a SACLOS system, half of the tracking is done by the system, the other half is done by the operator. Most often, and in the case of the SA-19, the missile tracking is done automatically, and the target tracking is done manually. So, any of you that haven't used combined arms, tried to have it go in the SA-19, you'll know exactly how it works. Essentially, the operator is maintaining a visual lock, so to speak, on the target, and all the automatic system does is track the missile in the SA-19 by means of a flare, an infrared flare in the base of the missile, which is why the SA-19's rocket motors are on the sides, incidentally, and it tracks the position of that flare, using that, triangulating the position of that flare, therefore the missile steers the missile onto the target. Those of you that have looked in TACView, you'll see that, you know, the missile follows that path I mentioned earlier on, where it's very much a sort of curving path to the target as the target passes across its line of sight. That's why. That's what the missile's doing. Downsides of SACLOS is it's not great against a high speed, or more accurately a high line of sight rate target. So if you've got a target that is crossing your line of sight, moving at high speed, or, you know, maneuvering around a lot, changing direction, the system is very hard to keep on target. One of the advantages of it is it does have a slightly lower possibility of intercept in terms of an RF side of it. So there's a lower chance of the target aircraft detecting the threat on the RWR, for example, because the missile's guidance signal doesn't have to be as strong as an active radar lock would have to be, because all you're having to do is send an RF signal out there to the missile, tell it where to steer. You don't need a return back from a target in the distance. In the case of the SA-19, obviously primarily the missiles are there to engage helicopters, so SAC-LOS in that case can actually be quite effective, versus, you know, fixed-wing aircraft, even the A-10, you know, it's very easy to defeat. Okay, last variation on this one is ACLOS, automatic command to line of sight. Similar, same sort of thing to SAC-LOS, only both sides of it are being done automatically now. So you've got an automatic computer system that is tracking both the missile and the target. There's very little practical difference between ACLOS and command line of sight that we mentioned before. The only difference is really in terms of exactly how it's being processed. So rather than... I'm trying to think how to explain it, to be honest. Basically, you've got computers essentially tracking both components of the intercept, the missile, and the target, and then steering the two together. So now you've got the automated systems doing the job of both the operator and the automated system in the previous example. The only system I'm aware of SAM size is the Swedish system, BAMS, or however it's pronounced. I honestly don't know. I don't know anything about it beyond a little bit of research that dug it up. And then there are some other, you know, surface-to-surface systems that use the same thing too. Right, as I say, when it comes to DCS itself, two command line of sight systems, SAM systems in the game, the SA-19 and the Roland. Roland, being RF SAC-LOS and optical command line of sight, it's slightly more dangerous than the SA-19 because it's got a better capability to track and lead the target, but otherwise, yeah, same sort of thing. And then onto our radio command systems, just a rundown of those. Obviously, the ones in italics aren't in DCS yet, with the exception of the SA2, because that's been added since I made this presentation. So as you can see, primarily all your early era Russian systems, with the exception of the 15 and the 22. Obviously, 22 isn't in DCS, thankfully. 15 is still Kolos, as is the 8, 6, 3 and 2. The only slight exception to those is SA6, SA4, which are command line of sight in the mid-course and then terminal semi-active. Okay, any questions on that stuff so far, or anything anyone wants to bring up?
Not for me.
Oh, sorry, I heard someone say something, but it all went very quiet. Okay, right, guys, we'll carry on then. So, next guidance type we'll briefly look at is line of sight beam riding. Most familiar, I think, to people, those of you that fly the K50, because it's what the Vicar uses. So, Vicar obviously using a laser, because line of sight beam riding can be laser. However, it can also be done with radar as well. Exactly the same principle. You've got a beam that's thrown out into space, and the missile just steers itself to remain in that beam. I can't think of any surface-to-air missile systems or air-to-air missile systems that use it, but it is a guidance type that is available. I won't run into the details of it for this, because obviously it's not something that's actually used. But if you want to read about it, you know, there you go. The most common one that people are going to be familiar with, I think, is going to be homing. As its name suggests, you know, weapon system homing on the target. 4 subtypes: passive, semi-active, active, and TVM, track via missile, or retransmission homing. The fourth one is the one that people are probably going to be least familiar with. The other 3, I'm sure everyone will at least heard of and have some idea how they work. So we'll sort of go over them not in too much depth, unless anyone wants us to dive into it. First one is passive homing. not really any examples of this in the surface-to-air or air-to-air missile environment. The only one you'll sort of see in the RF spectrum, at least, is something like the Harm, Shrike, stuff like that. The only passive homing that you're going to see in the missile world is infrared. So obviously every infrared guided system out there is using a passive homing technique, because the target itself is giving out all the guidance. The missile and the launching system is entirely passive in the engagement. So although it's, you know, using infrared rather than radar, it's still electromagnetic waves, same principle. It's doing the same thing. We won't go too far into the variations of that just yet. We'll come into the sort of the IR guidance system slightly a bit more later on. Semi-active, one that people are generally familiar with. Launching platform, be it a target tracking radar or an aircraft, sends out RF in the form of radar, and the missile tracks in on the skin return from that target. Couple of disadvantages to it. Firstly, it requires quite a powerful radar emission from the launch platform, and it requires the target to be in a aspect and environment that enables it to put out a decent skin return. The problem you've got with it is that the further away the launch is, you actually get into a point where the missile, although it can physically get to the target, doesn't have enough of a strong enough skin return from the target in order to be able to detect it. That's why some systems, like for example your SA6, you tend to use command line of sight first and then go into semi-active. So they drop into semi-active when they're close enough that their relatively small antenna could hopefully get them in a strong enough signal from the target to then guide in. You say most notably, air-to-air systems like the Sparrow, R27, stuff like that tend to use it. Active homing, this is where it all happens in the missile. So the missile has its own radar with both the transmit and receive. All the work is done internal to the missile, so the launch platform doesn't have to do any work whatsoever. In the air-to-air world, obviously Russian systems like the R77, AIM-120, Meteor, things like that use it. In the surface-to-air world, SA5 uses active in the terminal phase, but otherwise, trying to think, that is it. So yeah, the only SAM you'll see that is active is the SA5, which we don't have in DCS yet, although it is apparently coming at some point. The most mystical one is TBM, track by missile or retransmission homing. This is essentially a blend of command line of sight and semi-active. Now, what it basically does is, as with semi-active, the tracking radar sends out a radar signal into the ether, bounces off the target, and the skin return, heads out backwards. Rather than the target tracking radar picking up that skin return, the missile itself picks up that skin return. However, rather than in the case of semi-active, where the missile then processes that return and guides onto it, the missile sends that signal via a two-way data link back to the tracking station. The tracking station then does the signal processing and sends a guidance command signal back to the missile. So essentially, you are literally combining semi-active and command line of sight. Advantages of that, especially in the modern era, are that a missile obviously has a limited amount of space in it. The more stuff you pack into it, the heavier it gets, the bigger it gets, the more fuel you then need to put it through the air, so you start losing range, etc. And you end up with a very expensive, very big and chunky bit of kit. With TVM, you can pack all the complicated electronics into the guidance and launch system on the ground. So now you're not limited by weight, and you can have a lot more processing power to deal with things like countermeasures rejection, electronic countermeasures, that sort of stuff. The two main systems in DCS that use this are the Patriot and the SA-10, which is one of the reasons they're so capable. One of the reasons that they're so resistant to things like chaff and ECM is that all that processing power is now taken away from them having to be in the missile, and it's put in a much more, capable system, which doesn't have the space constraints and power constraints of a missile. Everyone happy with those?
Yep.
Yes.
Okie dokie. Right then, so just to run down what we've got in DCS then, and a bit of background as well. Semi-active systems. So, as we mentioned before in the previous bit, the SA4 is radio command mid-course and then terminal semi-active. SA5 is semi-active in the mid-course and then active in the terminal phase. SA6, radio command and semi-active again. And then the SA11 is semi-active and the SA17 is semi-active, as is the Hawk. Track via missile, so the ones we have in DCS, SA-10 and the Patriot. The 12, 20, 21 and 23 are all TVM as well. If we ever get the 20, 21 or 23 in DCS, just stay on the ground, to be honest, don't bother taking off. Unless you're also flying an F-35. So next bit we'll go through then, we'll start actually going through some of the SAM systems themselves, by guidance type, a few of their characteristics, and a little bit of background on them. Again, a lot of text in the slides, so I'll not read it out because you can read it later on. I will make sure the slides are all put up, updated on our website, and get a link posted up in the thread on the public boards for everyone to grab them later on. Okay, so we'll go through the different systems by guidance type, and then at the end we'll say, well, in fact, as we go through, if anyone's got any questions or extra info that they've garnered over their flying time in DCS, feel free to jump in, interrupt, and share it with everybody. Okay, so we'll start off with the radio command guided systems. Again, full list, but we'll go through the ones in DCS in particular. The exception is the SA2. I don't have any info on that because, to be honest with you, I've not been flying enough since it was introduced for me to add any info on that. So if when we get to the end, anyone wants to share any points or any experience they've gained on it, then please feel free. So start off with the SA3 then. Medium range air defense system. Command guided, as you say. It's a multiple launch and support vehicle system, so it's got target tracking radar and one or more launchers in the system, and it will also generally be supported by a P19 target acquisition radar, search radar. It's generally employed with 3 to 4 launchers per radar system in a site. However, obviously, DCS, it can be as many or few as the mission designer decides to add. Countermeasures rejection is surprisingly high, I would say. I think it's a lot higher in DCS than it should be, but it is what we're dealing with. When it comes to countermeasures, what you really need is a metric shit ton of chaff in the sky, combined with a beaming maneuver or a drag to defeat it. If you're at the edge of the envelope, launch envelope, when it launches at you, if you're at medium or high altitude, generally speaking, sort of a split S or a slice back combined with chaff will defeat it relatively quickly. If you're in the sort of outer 60% of its envelope, beaming combined with chaff is generally the way to go. If you're inside of that, it can be difficult, shall we say, without terrain masking. At that point, if the beaming doesn't work within the first couple of seconds, you're into last-ditch maneuvers, doing your orthogonal rolls, etc. to defeat it. Altitude envelope. All the altitudes in these slides are AGL, with the caveat that obviously if the missile site is at a particularly high altitude, air being thinner, etc., might extend its effective altitude up a little bit. But generally, it's about 25,500 20,500 feet, minimum effective altitude down to about 700 feet. So if you're at low level, it's pretty easy to get underneath it. Depending on what aircraft you're in, it's also relatively easy to get above it as well. But obviously something like the A10, if you're flying that, not so easy. SA6. So SA6, it's obviously a mobile system, both in DCS and reality. Tracked vehicles, both for the launchers and the TTR. The SA6 TTR is a combined target tracking radar and target acquisition radar. So you've got the search and TTR in the same vehicle. Obviously reduces the number of vehicles in the site. Again, generally 3 to 4 launchers per battery, although that does vary, and as always in DCS, it depends how many the mission designer decides to put in there. Three missiles per launcher. Altitude envelope is bigger than the 3, sort of all the way down to 100 feet AGL and up to 26,000. Again, defensive tactics pretty much the same as with the SA3. With the notable exception, it actually bites onto chaff a lot easier than the 3 does, in DCS at least. So normally, if you've got a relatively conservative chaff program, bumping out 1 chaff bundle per sort of second, it'll take 3 or 4 to bite on in most cases if you're on the beam. As with all the radar systems, if you're at medium altitude, you've got the energy, split S, slice back turn to get out of its range envelope. You can defeat it relatively easily. Obviously, of course, being a command line of sight system, the number 1 guaranteed way to defeat it is the terrain mask. Effective out to just under 20 miles, relatively high missile speed, just over Mach 2, and quite a long burning motor actually, to be honest. The one saving grace you've got with the 6 is quite a long acquisition time. So the point of which it detects your existence to it being able to launch a missile is just under 30 seconds. That assumes that you are pop up into its detection, and it detects you when you're already in range. So say you are terrain masked all the way, behind a ridge from the system, and you pop above the ridge to hit a target, inside the SA6's weapon engagement zone. You've got 28 seconds before it can launch a missile at you. Obviously, if you're coming in at medium altitude and it can see you all the way out, that 28 seconds no longer applies, because as soon as you enter its WES, if it's been able to see you for those 28 seconds already, it can launch straight away. The Gecko then, SA8, one of the earliest short-range radar-guided air defense systems in DCS. Relatively low threat, to be honest. Colos, as we say, same as the others, and it's 6 missiles per launcher, and it is a completely self-contained TLAR, transporter, erector, launcher, and radar. So both the search radar function and the target tracking radar and the launchers are all contained in one vehicle. So it doesn't need any outside support to engage targets. Acquisition time, much like the 6, high 26 seconds in the case of the 8, so you've got exactly the same tactics you deploy against it if you come in at low altitude. If you can pop up into its threat circle, but without it detecting you, you've got 26 seconds before it can shoot at you to either engage your target or engage it. Max range out to about 7.5 nautical miles, but it can engage all the way down to 50 feet. So it's quite a low altitude system. And I'd say unless you're flying a helicopter, you ain't going to get below its engagement envelope. Effective up to about 21,000 feet. Being a short range system, really, you're not going to have the time to split S away from it or get onto the beam or whatever, unless you're high energy. If you can beam it, again, it bites onto chaff very, very quickly. Otherwise, it's relatively easy because the missile isn't that manoeuvrable. It's relatively easy to do an orthogonal roll over the top of it, and it won't be able to follow you. Best bet is start off with a beam maneuver with chaff. If it doesn't bite on the chaff, once it's starting to get close to you, keep the chaff going and just pull up over the top of it, and hopefully you'll defeat it. If you're in A10 though, you will be low on energy after that, so hope you can get yourself out of the Wes before it shoots another one. If you're in one of the fighters, obviously slightly different. SA-15, the Gauntlet, aptly named. One of the more dangerous systems in DCS, as I'm sure you're all already well aware. It's very short acquisition time, really. I say down to 9 seconds. You don't get a lot of time, even if you can come in without it detecting you before it's going to get a weapon off on you. Missiles are pretty fast as well, and it's got 8 of them, so it'll guide two on a target at any one time. Normally in batteries of between 4 and 6 vehicles. Again, obviously DCS caveat that it depends however many the mission designer places there. Again, as with the 8, self-contained system, doesn't require any other vehicles to support it. It's going to do it all on its own, and it was actually intended as the replacement for the SA-8 in the Russian infantry. Out to 6.5 miles roughly, and engage targets all the way down to 60 feet. As you will no doubt be aware and have experienced, it is also capable of engaging low RCS targets, as in missiles. So Maverick, Harm, etc. It will generally shoot them down all day long quite happily. When it comes to things like that, the only thing you can really do is try and overwhelm it with targets, essentially, both aircraft and weapons, to try and take it down. Best bet is to not give it a chance to shoot at you in the first place, but obviously depending on where it is in relation to the target you're hitting, that could be very difficult. When it comes to defending it, obviously the only guaranteed way against the 15 is terrain mask. Get some dirt and rock between you and it. Otherwise, beaming it can work, does work. However, you need a lot of chaff in the sky. You're talking, probably down to 0.2, 0.25 second, between bundles, maybe even double bundles at that rate. And you're probably going to burn through 10 to 20 chaff bundles before one of the missiles bites on it. Given the time of flight, you may not have enough time for chaff to bite on it. When I was doing the testing for this, I would say it bit on chaff early enough for me to defeat the missile, maybe 50% of the time at best. Okay, command line of sight systems then. So the 2 we got in DCS, the SA-19 and the Roland. The 19, it's a bit of a double death system. Obviously, you've got both the SA-19 missile system and you've got the gun system as well. SA-19 was introduced into the Russian infantry to replace the Zeus. Generally, sort of follows the same pattern. Will be embedded with armoured units, normally battery of 4 to 6. Again, usual DCS caveat, whatever the mission designer puts in. Short acquisition time, effective ranges, guns obviously 0, but 1 nautical mile for the missiles. Generally speaking, in DCS, if it's got missiles, it won't shoot at you with its gun, unless you happen to somehow get close to it inside that 1 nautical mile, without it being able to engage you with a missile. So unless you're terrain masking and popping up right on top of it, or you're in a helicopter popping out from behind a building or something, you're not going to see it use its guns. The guns, to be honest with you, are actually more effective than the missiles. Great big 30mm bullet. If it hits you, even in an A10, 1 or 2 is going to take you out the sky. Missiles, relatively easy to defeat. As far as DCS goes, no countermeasures are effective. Because it is a SACLOS system, it is not radar guided, so chaff does not have any impact on it whatsoever. In real life, flares are employed against the SA-19 in an attempt to confuse the tracking system that's tracking the missile. However, that doesn't apply to DCS. Maximum effective range out to about 4 miles, but if you're on the beam, high line of sight rate, I think if I remember rightly, anything above 8 degrees per second, I think, hazy memory, it won't be able to track you. The missile will just keep coming and it'll fall behind you without you doing anything else. With that in mind, if you're trying to defeat it, stick it on your 3.9 line, firewall the throttles, and just maximise your line of sight rate. The missile will just fly behind you. If you're in close, say same thing against the missile. To be honest with them, against the missiles, the closer you are, the better, really. Versus the guns, same as a Zeus, just a ZSU break, vertical jink, which we'll go into later on. Roland, pretty much the same thing. It is slightly more effective than 19. It has a better capability to lead the target slightly, and it doesn't have a gun system. So the advantage you've got against it is a slightly longer acquisition time, 11 seconds, and it has got a shorter minimum effective range and a longer max range, and it can engage targets down to about 500 feet, slightly below. Countermeasures, unlike the 19, in DCS, chaff is effective. In the case of the Roland, it has quite a good chaff rejection capability, though. So really, the most effective way is terrain masking if you're down at low level, or just break turn, put the missile on 3-9 line, and fire all the throttles and just kick chaff out and hope you can defeat it. Missile time of flight is such that, with it being a short range system, if you're flying directly at it and you try and do a split S and turn away, you're probably not going to be able to get out of its effective range before the missile gets to you. Okay, any questions on any of that stuff so far, or any points anyone wants to add?
Just one thing about the gauntlet. I think the version we got in DCS is only able to ever track one target at a time. So as soon as a second missile is heading towards it, I think it will be over.
Yeah, indeed, you're correct, actually. That's a very good point. It can guide 2 missiles, but only against one target. So yeah, if you've got, it's one of these things where it depends greatly on how many, systems you've got in a battery. If you've got a SA-10 site being defended by, 2 batteries of 6 SA-15s, for example, it's going to be a massive problem. If you've got 1 15 sat on its own in a field, it's going to be relatively easy to take it out, even for like a flight of 2 to 4 aircraft. Any more before we move on? Okay, semi-active systems then. So, first one we see in DCS is the SA-11. Quite a high threat, to be honest with you. When we did the testing in the early days, we couldn't really get the acquisition time down, so that's not effective. We've not really got that in there. Likewise, minimum effective range. We couldn't really establish that, so if anyone has that, please feel free to share. Effective out to about 20 miles and down below 500 feet, and all the way up to 45,000 plus. So it's one of the first systems we've come across that, doesn't matter what you're flying, how high you are, how low you are, it can get you. Very good countermeasures rejection. It's also one of these strange systems whereby it's a TLAR, so it's, transporter, erector launcher, and radar. However, it does generally operate with the Snowdrift target acquisition radar, search radar alongside it. It can, however, still operate on its own. So if you've just got one TLAR without search radar, it can still find and engage targets. However, its range is greatly reduced. Again, I don't have the numbers on that one. I never got as far as doing the testing on that. So if anyone has any advice, any sort of experience of it, please feel free to share. As far as defensive manoeuvres, to be honest with you, they're pretty standard, as I'm sure you'll see in DCS. Obviously, number one, terrain mask. If it can't see you, it can't shoot you. Otherwise, high speed split S into S turns if you're at higher medium altitude, especially in a fighter, or stick the missile on the beam, kick the chaff out, and they bite on chaff relatively easily actually for a double digit system. Not as quickly as something like an 8 or a 2, but compared to, I think they actually tend to bite on chaff in my experience slightly more easily than a 3 does. The Hawk, this one very much depends on what kind of battery you've got that you're coming up against, if you are coming up against it. It's one of these systems that it can operate, with search radar and its 2 target tracking radars, or it can be in a larger battery with 2 target tracking radars, in which case the one battery can engage 2 targets. Essentially, it's one target per TTR. On par with the 11, maybe slightly less effective. Moderate acquisition time, range out to about 25 miles, same altitude envelope as the 11, and pretty much the same sort of defensive manoeuvres against it. Stick it on the beam, split S away from it, you're good. The missile isn't the most manoeuvrable in the world, so you can break over the top of it with an orthogonal roll. However, that relies on you seeing it. Unless you're at relatively close range to it when it launches on you, the motor's going to have burnt out by the time you get there. So, you're going to struggle to see the missile. Again, generally, if you're in a fighter, split S, slice back away from it, throw in some S turns to bleed it a bit of energy, and you'll outrun it relatively quickly. Okay, TVM stuff then, the scary shit. So, in DCS, we've only got 2 at the moment, the 10 and the Patriot. SA-10, as best as we can work out from the numbers in DCS between what it does in the sim and what's in the Lua files, it's the SA-10D we're dealing with. Although, to be honest with you, there is, as always, a bit of ambiguity in this stuff for DCS, because the capabilities tend to sort of blur between 1 or 2 different systems, different variations of a system, so it's difficult to determine exactly what you're dealing with. SA-10, yeah, generally speaking, it's going to be 3 radar system, so you're going to have the 2 target tracking radars, so the long range system and the low altitude system, and you're going to have the search and you're going to have the 2 search radars, long range and the low altitude, and then you're going to have the target tracking radar as well. SA-10 can engage 6 targets at the same time, supporting 2 missiles each, so 12 missiles in the air at any one time. The caveat to that is, because the target tracking radar obviously has to be facing towards the targets, they all have to be in the same hemisphere. I think it's roughly a sort of 120 degree field of regard for the radar. So essentially, if you've got 3 coming from the north, 3 coming from the south, it can only engage half. So when it comes to taking it down, you split your forces, you can generally get somebody through, as long as somebody's occupying it. Effective in DCS, at least when we tested it, it was out to about 40 nautical miles, all the way into 3. So obviously, if you can somehow get to within 3 nautical miles of it, and it doesn't have all the close-in protection it should have, like the 15s and the AAA, etc., which any decent mission is probably going to have, you can try and get in close and do it that way. Acquisition time, 3 seconds. Essentially, it doesn't matter. You can't pop up and get weapons on it before it can shoot you in that time, really. Effective down to 50 feet and all the way up to 100,000 plus. So you're not getting above it, you're not getting below it, really.
A quick question on the Eddie. You mentioned that targets have to be in the same hemisphere of the tracking radar. Maybe this is a dumb question, but can you put multiple, just from a mission designer perspective, can you put multiple tracking radars facing different quadrants and allow it to guide, or can you only use one tracking?
Honestly, I don't know. Logically, yes, you should be able to add more than one, because you certainly can with the Patriot. I've actually never tested it. So yeah, I mean, if anyone else knows the answer to that one, jump in. But yeah, I think that's one that's definitely worth testing, to be honest, mate.
Okay.
Yeah, when it comes to defeating the 10, chaff obviously is the countermeasure to use. However, the rejection rate is incredibly high. I did test runs in the early days with 240 chaff bundles in the A10, and the missile hit me before all that chaff had gone, but I was kicking out chaff throughout its entire flight and it never bit on one. Other times you get lucky and it does bite on one. The problem you've got is, with it being such a long range system, it's up above you and the motor's burnt out long before it gets to you, so you struggle to see it coming. did do some calculations back in time, for maximum time of flight, etc., and things like that, so you could try and work out if it had flown past you, but I forget those numbers, and I don't have them handy. I can't remember if they're in the threat guide or not. But yeah, essentially it's the same old usual defensive tactics for DCS. Obviously, the only way you can guarantee to beat the 10 is the terrain mass behind a big mountain. If you can't do that, the most effective is, if you're at medium and high altitude, split S away and then S turn out to try and bleed it of its energy. Stick it on the beam. If you're an A10, forget that. If you're in a Viper or a Hornet or whatever and you can exceed Mach, then you might do it, but it ain't easy. And then, yeah, the other alternative is just be as fast as you can and try and break turn to, force the missile to overshoot. But that, again, is very low chance of success because it's a surprisingly low missile for something that's so big. Battery sizes. The template in DCS is 8 launchers, each with 4 missiles. Obviously, again, mission designer can add as many or few as they like. So yeah, that's not really something you can overly rely on, unless obviously you've been given intel on that from the designer. Normally, as with all the medium range and long range systems, they're not going to be sat on their own. They are going to be, inside a SAM sort of bubble, protected by, normally at least one battery of SA-15s close in, AAA, etc. And then you're normally, if you're going to design a realistic mission, at least you'd normally have SA-10 batteries overlapping with SA-11 batteries in between them, and then 15s and God knows what else. So it depends how nasty your mission designer is as to how much of a threat and how unbelievably scary they are. Patriot then, in terms of capabilities, basically the same as the SA-10 in DCS at least. Again, greater than 90% chaff rejection. Very difficult to evade. Again, slightly longer range than the SA-10 in DCS at 58 miles. And again, 500 feet below and 45,000 feet plus. Really, same as the 10. Really, up to like 100,000 or so. Same kind of deal with defeating it. You can either try and split S and just run away and hope to bleed its energy out, or just stick it on the beam and hope you can lag it out that way. Again, if you're subsonic, you're going to struggle. Really, if you're whatever jet you're in, it's a hit emergency jet, turn away, and just firewall the throttles and try and outrun it. If you get shot at it and you can't terrain mask, it's a mission-ending threat system, as with the SA-10, even if it doesn't kill you, because the only way you're going to stand a chance of defeating it is to be as low drag and as fast as you can get. Okay, any questions on that stuff before we move on to the IR stuff? Okay, right, we'll go through the IR systems then. Starting off with the Stinger. One of these systems that it very much depends on the mission designer in terms of what its capabilities are. Obviously, numbers, locations, all that sort of stuff. IR guided, obviously. Reload time is about 12 seconds between missile shots, and each operator carries 3 missiles. The exception to that is if you've got the Stinger command unit, Stinger Com, in the mission editor, that basically gives it a much higher. I can't honestly remember if it's just a larger count of missiles or it's an unlimited number of missiles. If anyone knows the answer to that one, you can refresh my memory, because I honestly can't remember. But yeah, if you've got a Stinger Com in there, it increases the number of missile count essentially. Acquisition time, I would say around 6 seconds, and it's effective only about 2.5 miles. No minimum effective altitude. Even if you're in a helicopter at hovering 5 feet off the ground, it can still engage you, and it's up to about 12,000 feet. Flares and active infrared countermeasures are very effective against it. It doesn't take many flares for a Stinger to bite. Normally, even if you can get a burst of like 3 or 4 flares in the sky, it'll tend to bite on them. As with most systems, stick it on the beam, get the countermeasures out if you've got time, although given its short range, not that easy. Out of plane break turn, generally quite effective, as is the orthogonal roll. If you can get over the top of the missile and just out G it, which isn't that difficult, it's pretty easy to defeat. Chaparral, not a particularly effective system. Quite an old system, really. I can't remember when it was retired from the US inventory. I can't remember if it was the early 80s or the late 70s. If anyone knows, shout out. But it's based on the AIM-9D Sidewinder. So pretty old, not overly effective. Only effective out to about 3 nautical miles and less than 10,000 feet. It just tends to bite on flares pretty much straight away. You kick flares out, it's almost guaranteed to bite on them. You're going to be quite unlucky if it doesn't. Although, as always, it's best to assume it doesn't, so, still make that brake turn to try and give it some angle problems. 4 missiles per launch vehicle. I certainly don't use them in my missions. Obviously, everyone's different, but, whoever your mission designers are, whoever's building missions for you, yeah, if they use them and you're against them, then not a massive worry unless you're in a helicopter, really. Okay, the SA-18. One of the things I think most of us are most familiar with. Again, quite similar in performance to the Stinger. Again, very susceptible to infrared countermeasures, both flares and active IR countermeasures. Same defensive techniques. The only sort of caveat really is the bit of ambiguity in DCS. I'm sure many of you will have seen in the mission editor, you've got SA-18 Igla S, and then in the Georgian side of it, if you use the SA-18, it's just the SA-18 Igla. Well, the Igla S is the SA-24, not the SA-18. So there's a bit of an ambiguity, again, over what DCS is actually modelled. So for, keeping it safe, it's best to assume that the SA-24 is what you're going up against all the time, because ED doesn't seem to have grasped the difference between the SA-18 and the SA-24. So with that in mind, SA-24 Grinch, it's the most up-to-date Russian manpad system. It's the current generation Igla. Performance-wise, it's very similar to the Stinger and the 18 in terms of range, altitude envelopes, etc. The only difference is it's got a much better countermeasures rejection, up to about 85%. So it will bite on flares, but you're going to need a lot in the sky for it to do it. As always, DCS countermeasures, both chaff and flare, are just dice rolls. So the more you've got in the sky, the more likely it is to bite on one of them. SA-9, to be honest, it's more of an annoyance than a real threat. Very high smoke motor with a 10-second burn time. You're going to see it coming long in advance, unless you're, flying around looking at your MFDs all day at low level. To be honest with you, you can generally defeat it without flares. It's not that maneuverable. As long as you see it coming, you can break or orthogonal roll across the top of it or whatever relatively easily. If you kick some flares out, it's almost guaranteed to bite on them. It's down. It's sub 20% on the countermeasures rejection. Pretty short range. Again, it's the same sort of performance envelope as the manpads. And it's also worth noting that at night the system cannot engage you. It doesn't have a night capability in DCS. Yeah, you can fly around it in circles at 6,000 feet, and it won't even react. SA-13, replacement for the SA-9, a bit more of a threat, but it's still not the most dangerous system in the air. It's still has quite a low countermeasures rejection rate, so as long as you see it coming, you can get flares out and react to it. You've got a very good chance of defeating it. So really, for a fast jet A-10, it's harassment more than a major threat. Helicopters, obviously, if you don't see it coming, it can bite you. But for the most part, you're going to be okay. Only effective out to sort of just below 3 miles and 15,000 feet. However, again, it can go all the way down to about around 75,000. Sorry, 75 feet, not 75,000.
Hey, Eddie, real quick, have you tested the effects of weather, so like fog or clouds on systems in DCS?
Yeah, no impact in DCS at all.
Okay, thanks.
With the exception of you can't see them coming. Yeah, obviously, yeah, fog and clouds, etc. should block the IR systems, but in DCS at the moment, at least, they don't. Hopefully that'll change with the new clouds, but hey, I won't, put a bet on it.
Gotcha.
Has wind effect on the missiles during launch?
Wind?
Yeah, because you have wake turbulence and such a thing. Is this affected in the missile?
I don't think they've modelled it in DCS. And in reality, yes, it obviously has an effect because they're travelling through the air mass. However, the speed and everything else and the small size of the missile means that in practice, it doesn't have any notable effect on the weapons engagement envelope.
Okay.
Yeah, ultimately, you as an aircraft are in that same air mass. So whatever effect the air is having on the missile, it's also having on you. So, yeah, it sort of it cancels itself out essentially as soon as the missile is out of the boost phase. Okay, so next bit then we'll go through a few bits of surface-to-air missile defences, some of the manoeuvres and stuff. And yeah, I'll in the chat I'll put the links to the videos if you want to go and have a look through them. So 4 manoeuvres we'll go through: outplane brake turn, orthogonal roll, Doppler notch / beam, and dragging. So first one, outplane brake turn. Hang on, let me open up the link and stick it in chat for you so you can see it. Obviously, at your own leisure, you don't need to watch it now, but feel free if you want to. Outplane brake turn is basically a roll out of the missile plane of flight followed by a high G pull. Most easy manoeuvre you'll see, even in the A10, pretty easy to perform. It is an energy bleeding manoeuvre, as are all defensive manoeuvres really. So especially in the hog, you're going to be very low on energy when you get that when you do it. The faster the airspeed you are when you start, the more effective it's going to be because you've got more G available. The way it works is you're creating turn rate and angle problems for the missile. So you maneuver out of plane, that missile has now got to maneuver in at least 2 dimensions to regain its intercept course on you, causing it to either bleed energy if its motor's already burnt out, or potentially to exceed its capability to turn even if the motor's still burning. In order for it to be effective, you need to be able to see the missile. If you don't see it coming, you can't maneuver against it. And as with everything, it's both a kinetic maneuver combined with countermeasures for best effect. You don't rely on just one method to defeat the system. You're trying to use everything you can. If possible, descending brake turn to maintain your energy, give you more G because you've got God's G on your side as well. However, obviously, if you're in one of the fighters and you've got all the airspeed on your side, it works perfectly well going upwards as well. If you're in Viper, Hornet, Viggen, whatever, you've got all the smash in the world. You break up, it might get you not only defeating the system but also out of its threat envelope as well. In the A10, obviously, that's not really an option. This is one of those sort of situations where being down really low in the weeds can actually be damaging to your survival. However, it's always one of those sort of toss-ups between getting below the radar stuff and being high enough to defeat the IR stuff. Really it depends on what the most concerning threat is at the time. So, execution then, you roll to place the lift vector 90 degrees to the missile target plane. So basically, if you draw a line through space between the missile and you, that line is the missile's plane of flight. So 90 degrees reference to that, and pull. Maximum available G. Obviously, in the A10 or any other aircraft without digital FCS, don't over G or over AOA the jet, because that'll be counterproductive. Pull as much G as you can while staying in control, and then kick out the chaff and or flare. Questions on that one? Okay. Next one then, orthogonal roll. Massively energy bleeding, this one. And as with most of them, the faster you are when you start, the more effective it's going to be. And it's most effective against your older missile systems that have only got 2-axis control. So SA-8s, your older manpads, SA-9, I think SA-13, and some of your early, basically mostly single-digit stuff. So you're creating angle problems in all 3 dimensions that the missile has to solve, and hopefully is unable to solve, which causes it to drop into a lag pursuit and flying below, behind, above you, whatever, outside of its warhead detonation range. Again, you need a tally on the threat missile for the maneuver to be effective. If it isn't, if you can't see it, you just can't do this. It's as simple as that. An out-of-plane break you can do based on a scientific wild-ass guess. Orthogonal roll you can't. Performing an orthogonal roll is, the idea, you pull up, you basically say missile's coming from your left-hand side, look at the missile, wait until it starts getting close to you, pull up and roll over the top of it, essentially is what you're doing. So you're pulling and rolling to try and keep the missile at the same point on your canopy while you do the full roll. So it's essentially an extension of a barrel roll. A barrel roll with more G is what it boils down to. The 4 to 5 G pull value is based on the A10. Viper, Hornet, whatever, obviously your G value is going to increase depending on your airspeed. Essentially, as long as you remember the last point and keep the missile fixed on the canopy, you'll be doing the right thing. This is basically the last-ditch maneuver for any threat you come across. Any missile threat, air-to-air, surface-to-air, whatever. This is the last one in your arsenal. All else fails, try this. Any questions on that one?
Does it matter if you have SEM or air-to-air missiles, or can you do on both?
No, it'll work on both. Obviously, as I said, you need to be able to see the missile really for it to be effective. So if you're going up against a medium range air-to-air missile and you can't see the motor's not burning, whatever, then chances are you're going to struggle. But obviously with your SRAMs, you're going to struggle to have enough time really to react to it. But it will work. If or say it will work, it can work. It is always your last thing to try. If all else fails, orthogonal roll.
Copy.
However, it doesn't matter what you're flying, you are going to be low on energy after you do it. It's going to bleed off a couple of hundred knots or more doing this one. So, if you're in the air-to-air environment and you've got the energy to do it, obviously being slow is better than being dead, but it might leave you in a bit of a vulnerable position for a follow-on shot. Okay, next one then, beam. Obviously, most simple one really that everyone's going to be familiar with. Most effective against medium and long range threats when they're launching, at the edge or at least in the outer sort of 60% of their missile engagement range, and most effective against the older generation systems with the poor clutter and countermeasures rejection. Works in 2 ways. Firstly, by reducing the closure to the target, so you reduce your radar return, causing it to basically hopefully lose lock on you altogether, or increasing your line of sight rate, so you're basically generating angle problems and tracking problems for the threat system. If you can see the missile, it's more effective, as with all of them, and it massively increases the effectiveness of chaff. In DCS at least, if you're high aspect, heading at the target, chaff is a waste of time. If you're beaming or dragging, chaff is effective, most effective in beaming. Key point for this one though is, at least against the surface-to-air system, you have to employ chaff. It isn't going to work otherwise. Against an air-to-air system, it's a bit more difficult, but because it's a bit more complex. The notching maneuver is basically an evolution of a beam. The only thing is you need to make sure you keep the radar itself, be it the air intercept radar on the aircraft or the radar on the missile if it's an active missile, on your 3-9 line all the way through the flight. So that normally means, depending on what range the weapon system is when you're trying to defeat it, you might have to sort of do an arcing turn. And in order for it to work against an air-to-air system, you have to be below the threat. If you're above the threat, it will not work as a notch. It will still work as a beam, though. So, execution, maximum performance turn to put the threat on the 3-9. So, yeah, turn as fast as you can. No sense in doing a 60-degree bank and doing it slowly. If you've got 9G available, use 9G. If you've got 4G available, use 4G. Turn as fast as you can, essentially. Get the nose down to maintain and regain energy, fire all the throttles, and then dispense chaff or flare as appropriate. Questions on that one? Okay, next one then is drag. High energy kinetic maneuver, so it's basically you're now using energy to defeat a threat. This is one of those systems one of those methods that is only effective at medium and high altitude against a medium and long range threat. Again, only really effective out sort of beyond 50-60% of the threat system MES, so beyond the motor burnout range. And what you're doing is increasing the range to intercept and bleeding the missile energy. And rear aspect as a side effect of that increases chaff effectiveness. So execution is as simple as a split S or a slice back turn, which can be used at low altitude, but it's less effective. Essentially, the idea is to point your tail to the threat and run away as quickly as you can. And then once you've got the threat system on your 6, you follow up with 30-degree turns left and right at 3 to 4G, basically doing a S turns. What you're doing then is changing the intercept point for the missile left and right every couple of seconds. So obviously, if you pull 3G, a missile will have to pull 12G. It's bleeding its energy very quickly. So between flying away from it and causing it to turn, you bleed away its energy. And that's effective against both a surface-to-air and an air-to-air weapon system. As soon as you've defeated the missile or dropped the lock, that's it. You can light the burners and turn back in on the threat if you want to go kill it. Right, we'll crack on. As I say, not much more to go through. Only a few more slides, really. And then we'll sort of see where we go. So this bit then, mostly, to be honest with you, a bit of real-world background to a degree, and then we'll sort of add a few DCS caveats as and when. So first bit we'll go through then is just a bit of background on RWRs. So RWRs, as the name sort of suggests, radar warning receivers, passive systems in the aircraft that detect, classify, and indicate to the aircrew RF emissions that are being intercepted by that system. So what you'll get is a number of sensors on the outside of the aircraft, passively detecting radio signals, radar, emissions coming at the aircraft, and then attempting to classify them and then identify and present them to the pilot as information on some form of display system, normally with at least azimuth indication, however also range and relative altitude as well in a lot of systems, although the latter two aren't really reflected in DCS. Number of different ways that RWRs work. Obviously, the more modern aircraft you get, the more clever they get. Real world, what tends to happen is you'll initially get, say, radar paints your aircraft at range. It may take an amount of time for the RWR to receive a signal that is strong enough times for it to be able to identify it's being painted to start with. Once it does that, it will attempt to identify that threat by referencing it to a threat library programmed into the aircraft's mission data set. If it isn't in the mission data set, it can't identify it. So if the enemy, so to speak, changes the radio frequencies, pulse repetition, etc. of their radars, that will potentially mean that the RWR can't identify it or will misidentify it. In the case of misidentified or unidentified threats, or initially, what you may get is an unknown threat pop up on the RAW. Something that we don't tend to see in DCS because it isn't simulated to that degree, with the exception of, you may have seen in the past when ED's added it or someone's added a new aircraft to the sim, you'll get a U pop up there until someone adds it to the Lua files. Obviously, real world, you'll generally get an unknown, or not generally, you could get an unknown first before the system has the ability to classify it and give you a proper identification. The timing on that obviously is, not going to go into that. Varies between systems and obviously not going to go into obvious reasons. In terms of the way it ranges it generally works on angle of arrival at the centre and also relative time between two or more sensors. So if you've got, 4 sensors around the aircraft, the RWR system will use a mixture between angle of arrival at one antenna and the relative time between it arriving at, say, the forward and rear antenna or the left and right antenna, or a mixture of all of them to determine what the azimuth is to the threat, and also, in some systems, the relative elevation and range to that threat. The RWRs we have in DCS generally work on, rather than range, they work on threat priority. So the closer something is to the inner ring or the inside of the RWR scope, the higher the threat it is. The caveat I will add to that is that the DCS, the way that certainly ED have programmed it, I'm not sure about some of the third-party jets because I've not flown many of them, is that quite often you will see a indication that something is a high threat when in fact it can't even shoot you, whereas something that is actually shooting at you can be in the outer ring and is presented as a low threat. Real world, obviously, threat prioritization is a lot smarter than that. Also, something that real world RWRs can do that they don't do in DCS is differentiate between friendly and hostile. Obviously, real world, that's done with the threat library. So, for example, if the enemy hasn't got F-15s and you have, that if an F-15 pops up on the RAW, it's friendly. Simple as that. Again, not something that's done in DCS. Obviously, difficult to do in DCS for obvious reasons because, who knows what you're going up against depending on what the mission designer builds. Ranging, it's generally done by things like normally kinematic ranging. So over time, as angles change, essentially triangulation, the system will automatically resolve the range to a threat. Generally something that's in the more modern aircraft, where it will classify, range it, tell you whether it can shoot you and all of the manner of things. Any general RWR questions or anything anyone wants to add? Okay, say aircraft specifics then, I've only got some stuff on the A10, I don't have anything for the Viper, Hornet, or any of the stuff, so if anyone else has, feel free to add it in. A10, ALR 6069 system, which is displayed to the pilot via the IP1310 display. Works as we said. Threat library in DCS, it's fixed. It's not really adjustable. You can change the symbology, but that's it. If you want to go and delve into the lures, but you can't really change what it displays and stuff like that, or the prioritization. Really, that's it. The only sort of thing is it'll only display up to 16 threats at a time, which can get quite difficult in DCS sometimes if you've got a busy mission, because there's no filtering in DCS. So obviously, real world RWRs don't tend to display search radars unless the pilot chooses to disable the filter on that. Because obviously an search radar can't shoot at you, so you don't really care. In DCS we can't do that, so quite often you'll find that you've got, an RWR scope filled with search radars, and it drops off things that are actually able to shoot at you because of the prioritization issues. You can use the priority switch in the cockpit to reduce that down to 5, but again, the prioritization logic isn't very good, so it may not actually show you the 5 most important threats. So use that with care. As far as the actual performance of the RWR then, you've got 4 antennas on the A10. The same on most aircraft, to be honest. I think the Viper's the same, or if I don't have the field of view numbers. If anyone's curious, if you delve into the Lua files for the relevant aircraft on the RWR system, it'll give you the numbers for the field of view in degrees, number of sensors and things like that DCS uses. For the A10, you've got slightly overlapping coverage front and rear for the sensors, and they're out, essentially provide 360 degree field of view. Each sensor's got 120 degree conical field of view. So although this is a planform image, the same field of view is from the sides, front and rear. So it does essentially provide 360 degree field of view, depending on range. Obviously, if you're relatively close to a threat from above and below, your RWR won't be able to pick it up. Again, this generally holds true for all aircraft as well, but they say the specific numbers might vary. For the A10, same is true for the Viper as well, incidentally, in terms of symbology. Hornet, I'm not familiar with enough to comment. Same is also true for the F5 as well, actually, as this. You'll either have 1 or 2 alphanumeric characters denoting the threat, and it'll present the symbol will be presented on the threat azimuth, priority threat denoted by a diamond, airborne threat in DCS denoted by an upward chevron, lock-on, semicircle cap, and a weapon launch will be denoted by a semicircle below the symbol, which basically produces a full circle around the threat. Any more questions, or anyone want to add anything on RAWs before we move on? Okay, right, we'll move on to missile warning systems then. So a quick rundown. We'll start off with the A10 specifics, and then we'll go into a little bit of some of the other options you get in RWR's real world, and what we could maybe see in DCS at some point. So the more general background, passive or active techniques to detect missile launches or incoming missiles which present a threat to their parent aircraft, usually presented to the pilot either as part of a cockpit display and or using the automated countermeasures system. 3 types of MORS you'll get in operation across the world at the moment. You've got ultraviolet based optical systems, infrared optical systems, and pulse Doppler radar systems. We'll cover all of those. The A10 in particular uses an ultraviolet passive system. So you've got 4 cameras on the aircraft which filter out in the UV spectrum, detecting missile motor launch plumes. So UV-based system, solar blind UV spectrum, so it can't see the sun. So both the sun itself and solar reflections off water, glass, reflective surfaces, etc. aren't picked up. So it reduces the false alarm rate. Works well in high clutter. In DCS, obviously, it works exceptionally well in high clutter because clutter isn't modelled. So the only thing the system picks up in DCS is missile launches. It doesn't work well in it doesn't work well in clouds, obviously, because it can't see through them. But liquid water, in terms of a bit of rain on the sensor, rain itself isn't that much of it. Doesn't have that much of an effect on it. And they've got a very wide field of view. There's no scanning or sweeping involved in the system. It can see its entire field of view all at once. The downside of that is that it can't resolve angle that well in reality. However, not that quickly, should I say, but it can get it over time quite quickly. So it's good enough for it to be able to, steer a DIRCM system or an ERCM system. So like laser active IR countermeasures, which at the moment at least aren't modelled in DCS. And it's very simple, cheap, doesn't require any cooling or anything like that. So it gens, in terms of like retrofitted systems, so systems you fit into existing aircraft, it tends to be more common than the other two. Downsides of main one, obviously, the motor has to be burning in order for it to pick it up. So either if the missile launch site is out of range of the system, so if you're dealing with a medium or long range air defense system, it ain't going to pick it up. And if you're dealing with a short range system but your aircraft isn't pointing in the right direction, again, it won't be able to pick it up, even if you then turn such that it is in the field of view after the motor's burnt out. Can't derive range, however, in real life, it can potentially provide a time to impact in some systems, depending on how quickly the system signal increases in strength, and obviously more modern missiles with low IR and UV emission motors, it reduces the effectiveness. Secondary effect of the MAWS in the A10 is that it also operates as a laser warner system. Limited use, really, because there aren't any systems in DCS aside from on the Russian fighters. So in terms of surface-to-air missile systems, there aren't any systems that use laser. Obviously, MiG-29, Su-27, etc. with the IRST, they use a laser for ranging, so it may alert you to that. So if if you've got fighters around you and you see the laser warner pop up, that may well be what it is. If you're at low level, things like BMPs, tanks, etc. will set it off. So if you've got BMP-3s around, watch out for that, because it may well be that one of them's trying to shoot you. And as we all know, the BMP is probably the most effective anti-aircraft system in DCS. Yeah, that's a good point. It's got to be within DCS. It's inside of 8 nautical miles. It'll alert you to as well. Outside of that, it won't, just purely because of a DCS limitation. So for the A10, field of regard from the plan form, essentially it's the beam and the rear aspect. Forward quarter isn't covered by the MAWS. So if you're heading towards a threat, you ain't going to see it on the MAWS at least. Each sensor's, all 4 of them, has got a 90-degree field of view in a cone, so it gives you a 270-degree azimuth around the aircraft. And then also a 90-degree field of view downwards from the downward pointing sensor. If you're at medium altitude, obviously the downward pointing sensor will give you some coverage in the forward hemisphere, but it's not enough really for it to be that effective against most of the short range systems that you're going to care about from the MAWS anyway. I don't have any information on the MAWS on the Mirage at all. It's not an aircraft I've flown, so yeah, if anyone's got anything on that, feel free to share it as well.
Why did they not build one in front so that you can detect it missile launch in front of you?
Primarily, you might want eyeballs there to detect that. If you're, if it's coming out in front of you, you're gonna see it. Hopefully, your wingman's also going to see it. MAWS really is very much a backup system. It's there to help out because primarily, mutual support, etc., is going to pick up a launch before MAWS will anyway. Certainly in the way it's implemented in the A10 against short-range systems. One of the big problems for the A10 is the fact that there's not really anywhere to put it. You've got a big-ass gun up front, you've got the air-to-air refueling receptacle, RWR sensors, things like that. There isn't really a lot of space to put it and give it a reasonable field of view. You've also got the issue with things like weather, foreign object damage, debris, things like that. Even something as simple as a bug splatter, for example. That's going to give you problems with the sensor. And the number one reason, as always with the military, is price.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll briefly cover a bit more some of the other mores then. Again, these aren't simulated in DCS, but a bit of a real-world background for you, and you never know what will come in the future. 10 points for who can tell me what aircraft that MFD picture's from.
If it's your presentation, it's gonna be Eurofighter.
Well, I'll allow you to say that, but yeah, Typhoon. Yeah, that's the Typhoon's defensive display, so the equivalent of the RWR, morph display, and other stuff. Okay, so of the two other Morse types, then infrared is the first one we'll cover. Not massively used. It was one of the first ones developed, really, but it's not massively used. It's effective in clear weather. However, because it uses IR, it's subject to moisture attenuation and stuff like that a lot more than the UV. It can achieve longer detection ranges if there's no ground clutter and there's no limited moisture in the air, low humidity. If you've got like bright sunlight, etc., that can cause false alarms. However, there are ways to filter that out. It also has the potential ability to detect a missile after its motors burn out. So if you've got a high-speed missile, traveling supersonic speeds, the skin heating, thermal friction from the air will heat the missile skin to a level where an IR system could potentially detect the object coming in. However, that requires some clever programming to allow it to detect that without a lot of false positives. And it provides very good angle of attack information for point and DIRCM systems, and also it's very good actually at making decisions for automated countermeasures dispensing systems. Again, something we don't really have in DCS. Disadvantages, obviously, as we mentioned, weather, big problem for IR systems. It doesn't take a lot of water to completely blind the system, and it's got to compete with a lot of natural IR sources, so sun, everything else, a lot of false alarms, etc. Because of that, it needs a lot of processing power to get rid of those false alarms. That tends to drive the unit cost up a lot, which is one of the reasons it isn't used. And they do have quite a narrow field of view as well, because obviously you've got a longer wavelength. You have to have a more focused lens in order to detect the information and provide any kind of angular resolution, so you have to narrow the field of view down. So again, it's not generally very effective. It's not something you'll really see on fighters that often. Heavier aircraft, yes. Fighters, not so much. And it does require cooled detectors as well, in the same way that an infrared air-to-air missile, Maverick, things like that require a cooled sensor. FLIRs require cooled sensors, that sort of thing. Radar-based Moors then. The most effective of the lot, however, they are very limited in their employment. Obviously, I'm quite familiar with them because it's what we use on Typhoon. However, I'm not aware of any other aircraft that use them, but I'm sure there are. If anyone knows of one, feel free to shout out. But yeah, obviously, as you can well imagine, a radar-based system, it can provide distance, speed, direction, time to impact, all of it. So it allows very good, very rapid detection, very low false alarm rate, and it allows the aircraft to provide very good automatic countermeasures dispensing, maneuver advice to the pilot, etc. Doesn't need the motor to be burning at all, and ultimately weather has almost no notable effect on the system at all. So even if you're flying in thick cloud cover, the system will still be able to pick up a threat coming inbound. It's also able to determine whether a threat is actually heading at you or at somewhere else, or it's just another object flying through the air. Disadvantages, though, if you're in a sort of modern symmetric threat environment, active radar banging out the aircraft, it violates sort of the emission control principles, so it can aid in someone detecting your aircraft. And, low radar cross-section weapons obviously have a shorter detection range than, larger systems. So the smaller a missile is, the shorter its detection range. It also, because of the fact it's using generally HPRF radar, it can't, medium PRF radar, not HPRF. It can't determine azimuth accurately enough to steer, DIRCM countermeasures. Although fighters don't tend to use them anyway. And obviously false alarms can be caused by other RF sources and things like ground clutter and stuff. So you tend to have to use methods of filtering out ground clutter and such like. And it can also cause interference with air traffic control radars and stuff. So yeah, civilian agencies don't like it being used. Okay, any questions on the Morse systems? Okay, right. Bit of stuff on expendable countermeasures then. So, awesome picture. Start off with chaff then. If anyone wonders what chaff looks like, that picture on the right there is what it looks like. Essentially, it's small fibres. These days, normally glass fibre, fiberglass, etc., coated in metallics. Slightly thinner than a human hair, most of them. Not very nice stuff. You can breathe it in and it can go under your skin quite quickly. These days, first used in World War II, by the RAF, essentially dropping strips of tinfoil out of Lancasters and stuff to confuse German radar. Nowadays, obviously, much more sophisticated. Chaff, when ejected, floats around in the air. As you can see, it's very light. It takes a long time to descend and dissipate in the air, so it literally floats around as a cloud for a long time. And it's also quite sophisticated these days. So chaff isn't just random strips of material. It's actually cut down into specific lengths as dipoles to counter specific radar frequencies. So what you'll find in real world is, aircraft will have, or there are different types of chaff depending on what threat you expect to counter. And chaff tends to be mixed and matched in aircraft so that it can counter one or more ranges of frequencies. You have broadband chaff that can deal with a lot of radars but has obviously fewer filaments for each frequency, or you have more specific chaff to deal with more specific frequency bands if you know more accurately what the threat you're dealing with is. Essentially what chaff gives you is a false return for radar, and if you've got enough of it in the sky, it makes the sky radar opaque, so radar can't see through it. So not only do you use chaff from tactical aircraft to decoy threats, you can also use it in a offensive role to deny radar sight to the enemy. So one of the jobs that electronic warfare aircraft will perform, up ahead of a strike, in addition to active radar jamming with ECM, they will dump metric tons of chaff in the sky to confuse radars, give them problems, and literally blind the sky. So anything coming in behind that cloud of chaff is invisible to the radars in question. So again, chaff cartridge. So in terms of, that's the sort of chaff cartridge you'll see in the A-10s and most of the US aircraft. So obviously that's a demo model. They're not normally see-through. So you can see there, obviously you've got different lengths of chaff, two different types of chaff cartridge there as well, as you can see. Said obviously you've got chaff which are specific to threats. That's your upper one, where they're all short lengths. Then you've got a more generalized chaff where you've got multiple lengths. When they leave the aircraft, obviously what tends to happen is, with the pyrotechnic systems like you've got here, so US systems tend to be more pyrotechnic based, so you'll have a pyrotechnic charge which kicks the chaff out into the air, the cartridge bursts, spreads the chaff, and the airflow itself distributes the chaff in the airstream. It does not look like shiny silver bundles like you see in any sim ever. To be honest with you, apart from what is almost like a puff of smoke at the aircraft, it's essentially invisible. The main sort of types of chaff you've got, obviously you've got your pyrotechnic ones like you've got there, and then you've got your mechanically dispensed chaff, which is what we tend to use more in the sort of European side. So they're, rather than explosively ejected from the aircraft, they're mechanically ejected. US have started that, using that now in like the in the weapon station dispensers they've got on the pylons on things like the F-16 and stuff, because they carry a lot more chaff than the pyrotechnic systems. So to say, dipole, so yeah, radio energy reflector. If you've got it cut to the right frequency for the radar frequency you're dealing with, it'll reflect almost 100% of it. If it's the wrong frequency, it only just reflects a smaller amount of it. So that's where, knowing what threat you're dealing with, and making the chaff to counter that threat is most applicable. Obviously, this stuff isn't simulated in DCS as yet. The only sims I know that do, the only sims, I'd say sims because there's two of them now, is things like your, Modern Warfare, Command Modern Warfare or whatever it is. That actually, although it's only a non-3D sim, it does actually simulate things like different chaff types and flare types and stuff like that. So flares then, from the most basic, they are just big hot burning things that fly out of the aircraft into the air. These days they're getting a lot more sophisticated. Much like chaff, they are being more tailored towards specific threats. I can't actually show you that video link of different flare types as an example because it's no longer on YouTube, unfortunately, so I'll have to try and find it again. But yeah, the basic most sort of flares you got in the early days are just magnesium pellets, ignite, burn for a short period of time, really hot, over 1,000 degrees C, and hopefully burn hotter than the target aircraft's exhaust gases. So less sophisticated IR missiles will think, oh, that's a hotter target, I'll go for that. As missiles got more effective and started filtering out things like that, countermeasures also got more effective. So now we've got two broad categories of flares. You've got pyrotechnic and porophoric. Pyrotechnic are what you see in DCS, so they're your burning flares essentially. They are, exactly what they say. They ignite a material, magnesium, sulfur, whatever, and they burn. So normally between sort of 5 to 10 seconds, depending on the flare type and the size. Porophoric flares, on the other hand, operate on a chemical reaction rather than combustion. So they are essentially metallic objects that rust, oxidize at high, very high rates, producing heat and then cool. So not in DCS yet, but if you see videos or examples of covert flares, as US Air Force, US Navy call them, that's what they are. They're porophoric. They emit very little visible light, so hence the covert flare. They are visible, but only barely with the naked eye. It's a very low red glow, and that's it. They also tend to be smaller in size than, or at least some of them, than your pyrotechnic flares, so aircraft can carry more of them. And yeah, as you'll see when we get to some of the later slides, they have some big advantages as well over your pyrotechnic flares. So pyrotechnic flares then, so you've got your MTV flares, so your magnesium ones essentially, they're your early generation flares. The DCS, some of they used to be like this, but now they're more like the aerodynamic ones. In that you dump them out the jet, and it's what you'll see normally if in the US or someplace in Europe when they do flare demos. You'll see the flares kick out and they literally slow down to zero almost immediately. That's what your MTV flares will do. They're quite low mass, burn very quickly, and obviously as they burn, they lose more mass. So they tend to slow down the airflow and leave the jet behind, very quickly. So they tend to fall out of target field, the missile's field of view, and get rejected relatively quickly. Aerodynamic and prepared flares, they're your more modern variants of MTV flares. They tend to use the same materials in terms of what burns, but they normally, in sort of an airframe, for want of a better term, essentially look like a little dart, so they'll have fins on them so that they be more streamlined and, fly along with the aircraft for longer. And the more modern ones, rather than having it just a burning ball, essentially, they actually change it so that it burns almost like a rocket. So the flare gases are directed out the back of the flare, which propels it along. So while it will decelerate compared to the aircraft still, it keeps it with the aircraft for longer, flying in the same direction, which obviously helps counter the the countermeasures rejection logic on a lot of IR missiles. And the more recent sort of flares, now you've got spectrally matched flares. So what we've started doing is actually looking at the electromagnetic spectrum that is, emitted from aircraft, both, skin heating and the engines, and then matching flares to those frequencies. So the IR frequencies, that are emitted by the flare are the same as emitted by the aircraft, or as close as can be achieved, such that you're then trying to get around, that sort of more advanced countermeasures rejection of modern missiles. Pyrofluoric flares are generally always spectrally matched. Some of the pyrotechnic flares also now are getting spectrally matched as well. One of those toys that may or may not be available to you depending on which country you're flying for. Basically, if you're in the English-speaking world, you'll have them. If you're not, you probably won't. So, this is a bit of a test image from some flare testings by the US, obviously from a Viper. You can see that's your flares are essentially your spatially distributed flare. So this is your standard flare coming out the back of an aircraft. You see the reheat plume. Flares disappear quite quickly. It takes them a little bit of time to get up to heat as well. So when they come out the jet straight away, it takes them a second or two to actually burn at full temperature, as you can see reflected in the image. And if you think you're a missile looking at that, the flares actually aren't that bright compared to the jet, and they fall behind it quite quick. So if you've got a missile that's focused on a very small field of view for its target, they're ejected quite easily. Pyrofluoric flares, your spatially distributed ones, they're a little bit lighter, so they do slow down quicker. However, they look more like this. It's much more of a bigger plume. So from the point of view of a sensor of a missile, all of a sudden, the aircraft and the flare aren't looking all that different now. It's no longer a point of light, it's much more a blob. So it becomes more difficult for countermeasures to differentiate between the two. And they don't follow, a ballistic trajectory, which is the downside of them, really. Same again on the next one. This is more of a beamform view. Again, you see the flare disappearing from the back of the aircraft, slow down very quickly. So they don't work that well in the beam. Where they do work well, however, is rear aspect. So if you've got a missile coming up behind you and you're dropping, the pyrofluoric flares, spatially distributed out the back, all of a sudden, that missile cannot see you at all. So they're very, very effective for tail-on engagements. Then you see, inverse of that, from even just a slightly different aspect, the effectiveness is greatly reduced.